Proszę Państwa, witam Państwa i otwieram kolejny panel poświęcony tym razem Europie Środkowo-Wschodniej.
The new panel devoted to Central Eastern Europe and the Western Europe, which had a panel before, overstretched time by 15 minutes, but we won't draw any consequences out of that. But we, in that limited time, still will be able to prove that the voice of Central Eastern Europe is very vital for the European discussions. I will moderate this discussion in Polish because the panel here contains two Polish, one British who is treated already as a Pole, and also a German who was born in Poland and just said that Poland is his second homeland. So I think I am justified that in this situation Polish language will be the correct medium, but naturally there will be needs to translate into English. Yesterday I spoke to Jim O'Neill, the author of the famous book Brick, and he came to Warsaw to publicize his book. And he said in the conversation with me, if the Central Eastern Europe was a region, it was also something worth looking at closer. If the countries you wrote about are the region, and more so our countries are a region. And he wasn't totally convinced if we constitute a region. And this is why in our panel we will talk about the fact what our region has to offer to Europe and how our experience is vital to European experience, and what influence do we absorb from outside of Europe and from other countries of Europe, and what we contribute to it. And in this illustrious audience, we can welcome the previous president of Germany, who was also chief executive in the finance Commission in the European Union, and many other functions, but he also calls Poland his second home. Mrs. Professor Hübner, who is a member of European Parliament, but in previous in the past, she had several important jobs in the European Commission and the Polish government, member of several commissions in many different departments, in many different issues, but she's very well known as an economist, and her voice will be very respected. And again, I would like to introduce Professor Norman Davies, who is treated in Poland as a celebrity, and he's seen on our TV screens almost daily and comments on matters that are sometimes difficult to comment on for Polish people. And last but not least, we have Dr. Kulczyk, who is an entrepreneur and businessman and head of the Polish Capital Group, present on international market, which in itself is worth noting. I would like to start with a question to President Köhler. Is Central Eastern Europe, should it present itself nowadays as a region? Does Europe need another regional voice, or is it just an attempt of distancing yourself from countries who are in trouble and present? Because the perception of European Union in the past used to be much more simplified. We had new and old members, East and West. In this crisis, this perception has been transformed, and therefore I'm curious regarding your opinion whether presenting the countries of this region as a certain unit, a region that has its own message to offer to the European Union. Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador Reiter. You mentioned at the outset of your introduction the BRIC states and the definition of the BRICS. From the beginning, I want to say that it's always a fashion in politics and in particular in media and analysts and investment bankers' circumstances to label things and issues. And sometimes this is helpful, but sometimes it's also misleading. In the case of the BRICS, it was, of course, a labeling which was helpful in demonstrating to another grouping, the G7, that the G7's power is somehow declining because other regions or emerging economies like the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, come up. And the difference was in growth rates. If you would compare the situation today with the situation when the label BRICS was invented, today the BRICS are no longer so cohesive and so kind of threatening to the G7 because they now experience their own difficulties, and clearly there are also political differences in this grouping. Nevertheless, it helps to structure discussions. And insofar, I also totally think that in particular, Central and Eastern European countries have a kind of cohesion in terms of similarities or things where they have common history. They have things like that their development stage is below West Europe. And it is kind of legitimate that on this basis they also organize some dialogue amongst themselves and try to articulate interest, which is in favor of their own development. This is okay. If in the case of the European Union, the CEE, or the Central and Eastern European countries, would create a voice which could create a conflict between Poland and the EU policy, of course, then you need to see differences because Poland and Romania, Bulgaria are members of a unity which has common institutions, a treaty, directives, even commissioners who come out of these states. And therefore, it is difficult to compare these labels. But anyway, in order to demonstrate that these countries, Central and Eastern Europe countries, European countries, who are still in a transition somehow, who have different interests, they should be able to articulate these different interests. And I personally have in particular the kind of feeling that it's good to hear the voice of Central and Eastern countries because they have come out of a very bad history. The history of lack of freedom, the history of being a kind of centrally controlled and planned economy, which didn't work to the favor of the people. So now we see and hope that the Central and Eastern European countries move to a market economy, and are on the move to a multi-party democracy, and I feel it's good. And the rest of Europe should know that these countries have legitimately different, sometimes and in some areas different interests, and they should be able to articulate it. Again, this is my first answer. The members of the CEE within the European Union but should not understand their, say, kind of particular shape, not as a kind of dividing Europe, but bringing their interests within a Europe, because at the end, if the European Union is not able to demonstrate to their new members that they are a well-esteemed partner and that the vision is that Poland, Romania should have at the end the same living standards, then in the rest of Europe, the vision would lack a qualitative element.
Ja chciałem jeszcze do tego, co pan powiedział, nawiązać. Ja się zastanawiam, dlaczego to jest tak, że
To address what you mentioned before, it seems that European Union doesn't seem particularly interested in the fact that the history and experience of this country, of these countries, Central and Eastern European countries, should be made known and accepted into the ideas and participate in the competition of ideas in the world, because we've got Beijing consensus, BRIC countries, and yes, we could agree or disagree whether the region, that these countries constitute a region, but certainly we can agree that these countries propose a certain model and experience of history and development, because here we've got to do with countries that about 20 years ago made a decision to progress to a free market, democratic countries, and made a success of that. Therefore, shouldn't European Union more freely use that as a, let's say, good example? Mr. President, what do you think?
Well, I speak now as someone who has his own ideas and assessments, not as a kind of representative for Germany, but still, I'm a German. I'm personally happy, you see, to see Poland having success. I mean, Poland, for instance, managed this crisis quite much better than most of the West European and South European countries, and also somehow better than many Central and Eastern European neighbors. And I feel that this success story is a demonstration that at the end, the kind of dedication to freedom and a market economy pays off for the people. And I'm personally happy that this demonstration that freedom and the market economy works better for the people is demonstrated by developments in Poland. And therefore I want to see the Polish, success story being more known, for instance, in Germany, not least also in the so-called peripheral European countries, because there we have huge trouble. There is, of course, a crisis. And it seems to me that nobody feels he has any kind of guilt or was part of the disaster. It's just the financial markets who bring trouble, or some kind of conditionality from the IMF. But somehow the problems in the so-called the outer countries within the European Union is also that they didn't do their job in becoming competitive, in demonstrating to their young people in particular that freedom is really a value, and if you get trained and get the freedom to exercise your ideas and talents in a market economy, it will pay off. They too much relied on kind of redistribution of funds and welfare from the center. And I'm not against, of course, the element of solidarity within the European Union, but solidarity which is not based on the own efforts of all the members at the end will overstretch all of them.
Tu padło ważne słowo solidarność, słowo, które jest oczywiście kluczem w całej dzisiejszej europejskiej dyskusji i słowo pojęcie,
solidarity
być może
was
w tym
mentioned here, the word
europejskim kryzysie
solidarity, which
dzisiaj
is crucial for
podlega
European
trochę
history,
definicji.
and perhaps the word which in a current crisis is being redefined. The solidarity of the countries remaining in crisis is a priority in this situation. It's difficult to question it. However, there is a certain fear, for example, expressed in Poland, whether the countries who cope better in this crisis will now have to pay the price on behalf of the countries who cope not so well with this crisis, like Greece, and whether the idea of using structural funds from Brussels in the case of Greece obviously did not lead to success, just the opposite.
Do it also in English just to make it easier for President, and also because I suspect that Norman Davies will speak Polish, so I just think that we could have two people speaking English. Before I go to your question, I still would like to make reference to your first doubt about this rationale behind identifying the Central East European countries as a kind of region, because I have serious doubts. I was even thinking, why all of a sudden we are just getting this CEE thing again on the here and for the discussion, because my understanding is that Central East Europe is those of us who are in the European Union, but also those of us who are under the neighborhood policy, who are outside the European Union, still belong historically and geographically to this part of the continent. And I think, of course, today we are living one of those periods in the world, in the global economy, when we declare the end of multilateralism and move to regionalization of the global order. And and that's why we are looking for those regions that will be sort of in charge of the global economy in the years to come. And I think there is a different understanding of the region today, because BRICS or emerging economies are a form of a new region that might strengthen its internal integration and cooperation in the future, generating also problems for the European companies, for which the space there might be much smaller than we would like to have. So I think there is a need now to look anew at what really regionalization today might mean, because I think there is something in this idea of the role of the regions in the world to come. But I have serious doubts whether there is any value added in identifying again now the CEE as a region, in spite of those historical and geographical elements. Also, because I think that thinking in terms of such a region in a situation where we have European integration and in Europe, and when identifying part of the continent that is worth considering in isolation, I don't find much rationale behind that. And if I could just use what I think Willy Brandt said about Germany, I think it can be used also now. What belongs together should grow also together, and I think we should stick to this. This should be now the motto for the European Union, both in terms of the European Union in the narrow understanding, and also in the European Union, including the neighborhood policy, because I think there are convergence forces which are keeping us together, and there is political, economic, social justification for sticking together in this rather messy world that is around us. Now, on Solidarność, I know that it's not politically correct being a Pole and having doubts about the value of Solidarność, especially in Europe. I think I should be ashamed of what I'm going to say, but I think European solidarity has always had a kind of vested European interest behind it, which was peace, which was stability, which is growth, which is bigger internal market that would allow us also to have better living standard. And so there is a certain interest, not understood in narrow terms as a business interest, but I think a big social, political, economic interest behind the solidarity. And that's what makes me dream, what makes me sleep and sometimes is because I know that behind solidarity and the need of having solidarity is our major European value. There is this common European interest, which I think we can explain easily also to European citizens. Now on how the solidarity is sort of expressed, how it expresses itself in the European Union. There are various, it's not only structural funds. I don't like when we talk about, I'm sorry for saying this, about structural funds, which are just a financial instrument belonging to what we call regional policy and multi-level governance and the Europe of local and regional level, because Europe is not only Brussels. Solidarity seen through structural funds is not about money only, and this I think should be very clear. Additionally, European budget is just 1% of European GDP, and this is 1/3 of European budget. So this is really like statistical error when we talk globally, but this is absolutely incredibly important asset at local level, at regional level, where very often this is the only chance to invest, to catch up, to grow. And that's why I think we should see this multidimensional character of what we call in short structural funds. And there's nothing about structural funds that has indeed contributed to the Greek crisis. This is, I think, an abuse of the I'm sorry, I'm not talking to you now, I'm talking to all those who say those things. I think we should understand that the Greek crisis is about other stories, and it's also about Europe that did not see that structural funds were used to improve competitiveness, to improve productivity of Greek economy. As a result, we have today those huge macroeconomic imbalances between Germany on one hand and Greece on the other hand. And our duty today is also to see how you can use the European budget, every euro of it, in the best possible way to generate growth, but to address also those disparities which are growing in Europe now dramatically. And they reflect, I think, exactly these differences in competitiveness, the differentiation which the crisis has put to the
I wanted to ask you
surface.
an additional question, whether to return to Central Eastern Europe. I understand your points. However, I wonder whether we may need exactly in terms of competition of ideas, regions that offer a model of development, of growth. But no one objects against Nordic Europe. Nordic Europe, is it a group? Maybe it is a group, it's a model. It is a source of inspiration. Can you accept the term Central Eastern Europe as a model of growth, of development that may function well or less well?
First of all, as a model of political change. I mean, we still have in Central and Eastern Europe, we have democracies, we have para-democracies, we have situations far from democracies. If you treat Central and Eastern Europe in its entirety, it's not only EU members, no? It's also Moldova, Belarus, it's also Ukraine, and further on, because neighborhood policy is taking entire Central and Eastern European part of our continent into account, let's say. So if you think only of this part of Central and Eastern Europe, which belongs today to the European Union, but I think that you can see also the model elements when you include this broader Europe as well, but the most successful are already in the European Union. And of course, that was also because there was this light in the tunnel, so we very clearly knew where is our port, so all the winds were working for us, and we could be a model because we were supported also, because we knew what we wanted, because there was a brutally saying carrot and stick all the time with us, and we were supported in the reforms, and we had, unlike the Greeks have today, we had this light in the tunnel, and we knew that at the end there is a better quality of life, there is freedom, there is a going back to Europe where we always felt we belonged. So we were in a situation where we could do it in a moral way because we were also supported by the European Union. And that's why I think also this initial idea when the Arab Spring started, we should go there, we should tell them how to do it, but it doesn't work like this. So to use a model for yourself, it's an art, and I think you have to...
Yeah, maybe it doesn't work because we don't have enough self-confidence, because we don't believe enough in the value of this model. But I don't want to... I'd like now to ask Professor Davies, who is a historian. Historians are often asked about the future. I know that it's not a historian's job in the future, it's the past, but I guess we ask historians for inspiration for our thinking about the future. And I wonder whether you believe that Poland and the other countries of what we call, it's not precise, Central Europe or Central and Eastern Europe, whether they should be more self-confident in formulating their messages and in making contributions to a European narrative. The traditional European narrative is now in a crisis. Is that an opportunity for these countries to reformulate the European narrative or to become part of the European narrative? Professor Davies.
Thank you for the question. Of course, I think Poland and its neighbours have a much better chance today than in the last 50, 60, 70 years of making a contribution of changing the European narrative, as you put it. We've heard the phrase, the lack of self-confidence. I would like to turn briefly to another aspect of all of this, very closely connected to the role of Central and Eastern Europe, and that's in my field, education. Education has two aspects. One is educating the young people, again we've heard that, so that they can compete in all fields, not only economically but also in this competition of ideas. And from what I see in Britain and in Oxford, the Central European young people who come are, generally speaking, very well educated. They can compete. And they do compete, better quite often than British people. But there's another aspect of it. I've just been on a journey around the world, a world lecture tour. I visited, 20 different universities. And I'm very concerned about the lack of knowledge of Central and Eastern Europe around the world. And this is a very large obstacle. And I would say it doesn't apply only to India or Malaysia or distant places. It equally applies to Western Europe. Western Europe is very badly educated with reference to Central and Eastern Europe. Why is this? One is that there has been in the 20th century quite a powerful Orientalism towards Eastern Europe, this pejorative attitude to Eastern Europe, you call Europa B, as opposed to the supposedly more developed and more confident, more successful countries in the West. I never liked that division. But Western countries have looked down on countries to the East in the same way that they look down on countries in the Middle East, hence the famous phrase of Orientalism. That's a big disadvantage. it's also a huge disadvantage, the historical experience of these countries in the 20th century. Central and Eastern Europe when a number of countries like Poland either reappeared on the map or were created anew, like Czechoslovakia. That experience lasted less than 20 years. Then you had the Central and Eastern European countries of the Soviet bloc, again, at a great disadvantage in many fields. And now we have the third version of Central and Eastern European countries after 1989, countries which were not in the Soviet Union generally, but were not connected with the European movement until quite recently. And I saw the title of our meeting was Expect the Unexpected. One of the unexpected developments in the last 20 years is that education around the world about our area is in a worse state than it was during the Cold War. I've been to several American universities in the last 2 or 3 weeks. There, our region no longer attracts the interest of the federal government, which in the old days would finance centers of study, obviously of the Soviet Union, but also of the Soviet bloc. That's all gone. And many universities, I was at the University of Texas, for example, they've been told that their program on Central and Eastern European studies has to finish, there's no money, and if they don't receive private funding, it will collapse. And this, I think, is a general problem around the world. It's a general disadvantage for Central and Eastern Europe. And for Poland in particular, Poland is the largest of these countries, and yet Polish studies are in a much worse state than they were when I was a professor 20 years ago. The centre in London, where I taught, there were 8 academic staff in our little group. There's now 2 or 1.5. Oxford has no chair of Central European Studies, no chair of Polish Studies. Cambridge doesn't. Cambridge, incidentally, has received a large donation from the Ukrainians, which is interesting. Private money coming in to support regional studies. But I think our countries in Central and Eastern Europe must make an effort to reactivate knowledge in the world about our area. Otherwise, these countries will be at a permanent disadvantage. I can say a lot more, but I'll stop just there.
So you are saying actually that we should invest in knowledge or in image, because image has an enormous impact on the perception of a country or a region, especially if the perception, the historical perception, was formed by events and by a history that is now over. So managing perceptions is, of course, something we cannot expect that things change and the perception changes. We know that perception has its own specific rules. Should we invest? Who? Of course, this is a question more to the Polish parts of the panel than to you. But knowing other experiences, knowing other models, do you believe that the Polish government should invest more in knowledge and in the image of Poland?
Absolutely. Knowledge and image go together. We've all been talking, alas, the last 2 or 3 days about President Obama's gaffe. Why is it possible for the President of the United States to make such a gaffe? Among other things, because the image of Poland is not very high. Because there are very few people in the United States educated in knowledge about Poland. But this problem applies to all of our countries. And yes, the government, but also private benefactors need to cooperate, to invest in studies around the world about this area, and thereby to improve their profile and their image. Otherwise, everybody from these countries will be working at a disadvantage.
Ja chciałem teraz zapytać doktora Kulczyka, ale przedtem jeszcze profesor dr Köhler się zgłosił na Zwischenruf. Is it a Zwischenruf?
Professor Köhler has...
I would like to
Chciałbym...
a couple of sentences to that what Professor Davies said. He said, well, the Polish government should do more to make public the Polish experiences, the good Polish experiences with that development. But I want to add to this, the European Commission, I mean Brussels, the institutions, should do also more to analyze why, for instance, Poland gained a lot from also structural financing from the European Union. When you compare the success story in Poland with what happened in, for instance, Portugal, they got a lot of infrastructure investment, but still there's not really an autonomous growth dynamics. The entrepreneurial spirit is lacking in some of the countries who are now in a crisis. And therefore, I want to make a plea for not just to think about solidarity in redistributing money, or in the Germans have too much of a current account surplus. That's the basic problem of Europe. The Germans have to face that there is a problem in these macroeconomic imbalances, but in my view, at least from a point of view of sustained good development, the question about entrepreneurial spirits, the question how people react to these offers of a good infrastructure on their own efforts and with their own efforts is not yet by the Brussels institutions enough analyzed. The Brussels institutions feel themselves they are in charge to create better redistribution, but they should look why in some countries it worked better and why in other countries it worked less good. What are the reasons for that? Because otherwise the European solidarity is permanently only understood as a mechanism for redistributing funding.
Thank you. Dr. Kulczyk, that must have been music to your ears, wasn't it? To musiała być muzyka dla pana uszu, prawda? To, co powiedział teraz prezydent Köhler o tym duchu
To your ears, the spirit of entrepreneurship, how to reactivate the spirit of entrepreneurship. Will Poland and other countries in Europe have any offer, an attractive offer? Now, ladies and gentlemen, I've been listening to the discussion, and I've been just wondering, should we really educate the world? Why should we really educate the world? What is Europe? What's its heritage, legacy? We need to realize that there are 7 billion of people in the world, and in Europe, only 7% out of that 7 billion. It's not us to educate the world. We need to understand and get the awareness of the fact that we are part of the larger scene and that we are not the center of its attention. With what we've given to the world is a number of problems and issues. Crisis is not to be looked for. The causes of the crisis in Asia, on South America, it's Europe, it's the United States. 10%. The 6 billion of the people living outside Europe and the United States, maybe 2 billion think about how to get a pair of shoes, maybe 2 million think about homes, maybe 2 million thinks about a new car. if we don't, unless we change the way thinking in Europe and we try to subsidize Greece with the next 340 billion euro. For 340 billion euro, we could really restart or launch the African economy. We can obviously keep on talking about European funds and how important Greece, Spain are. It is very important, and the word solidarity is also important. It comes from the word of politics. In economy, we are talking about the equation, economic equation. Unless we acknowledge and appreciate the economic equation, we are back to square one. We started with Central and Eastern Europe. I believe it is a bit of provocation because this part of Europe has the biggest potential or opportunity to be the driver. This is where the driving force, this is where we have the generation, enthusiastic generation, a healthier generation, and a generation full of enthusiasm. And they have no burden of history. Socialism today is in the west of Europe. We were cured out of socialism. We have a green island here in Poland because we are not in the socialistic order. When unlike the others who want to divide what they have not produced. Our opportunity is not in the fact that we pay 100 million more to Greece. Our opportunity is in Africa, where the whole world turned their back towards. I've been traveling, and I was coming back from Hong Kong, Los Angeles, and I have a jet lag. I go to Lagos. I have no jet lag effect. Seeing the potential in Nigeria with 200 million people, and we are fighting for Russia. Or perhaps Nigeria has still a safe box, and we need to open it in terms of natural resources. Nigeria have a 40% more in terms of natural resources than Russia. We need to accept facts about the world. But I don't think we'll be able to do much in Africa unless we do our homework here in Europe, and we won't be going play hockey, won't evade or even avoid it, if we won't be able to spread the spirit of enterprise here in Europe. Well, I disagree with you. The homework is not to be done by those who were studying at school. We need to go somehow around the idea of globalization. Huge corporations, they develop across the world at the universal level. The world of politics lives in 4-year cycles, while the world of economy has a different method of calculating and accounting. We need to look at us. The global scale company act at the locally and the so-called be present locally. It's not possible. If we think about the 7% of the world population, are we prepared to solve universal problems, global problems? They won't be solved by small countries who have ambitions, historical ambitions and political ambitions. Perhaps the question was not the best question, but the answer was very good. Now, Professor Davies. Well, I've heard you loud and clear, Dr. Kulczyk. I do agree that such countries have to be present at the global arena. But mind you, we have the jungle of information, or the information jungle in the world. And suppose we have a Polish businessman in Nigeria. I think he's facing a greater challenge when he tries to get in touch with his Nigerian colleague, because his Nigerian colleague has no idea where the Polish businessman comes from. I think information is the key for commercial and economic success. In particular, when you think about contacts. Well, I've just come back from my journey around the world. The best center of knowledge about this part of Europe, I found this best center in Singapore. University of Singapore is a power, a superpower among universities in Asia. When you think about if anyone comes over to Singapore, they need to be identifiable because they need to see the sense of the context. So knowledge and education comes hand in glove with what you really aim at to get a better position, to be ranked higher in the world. I do agree with you. Otherwise, German companies wouldn't be investing that much about the knowledge of Germany, information of Germany.
The British professor speaking Polish, and now it's the Polish professor who is going to speak English. Is that correct? I wanted to add one element. We were talking about going international, going global, and I fully support that. We need that. However, look at the realities of Poland and other countries in this region. The share of Germany in the Polish foreign trade is roughly 30%. I recently spoke with a Czech official, and I said, you know, what is the share of Germany in our foreign trade? More than 30%. He said, you know what is the share of Germany in our foreign trade? I said, no, I don't. It's 70%. But this is the reality of our countries. How can we go global or international given this reality?
Can I? Okay, I'll try again to respond in English as you are suggesting. And I also think that what Mr. Kulczyk has said about the global, which we've been talking about globalization and global challenge for decades, but that doesn't mean that it has disappeared. I think this is still a major challenge for Europe, because Europe has started to continue to be inward-looking. It was justified during the first 50 years of European integration to be inward-looking in European terms, to establish institutions, to move forward, evolving in terms of the scope of integration, and then also the enlargement, which is also Europe. So I can understand that we could have been for quite some time inward-looking. Then the crisis has come and has even strengthened this tendency to the need of fixing the internal issues, and that is a huge risk that Europe will keep this mood of looking inward and thinking of how to make itself better and better prepared for what's going on externally. But I think that it's the highest time that now, when we finally understand that we have to be more involved in stimulating growth in Europe and not only stability, that we really open windows a little bit more widely and look what's going outside, and then we will see probably a lot of the problems that Mr. Kulczyk was mentioning. And I also think that for the big companies, especially especially today, and you see a lot of that, also changing business model to be able to act, to be present, to be successful in the markets of big emerging economies, not only in Africa. I think this is a huge challenge, and I wonder to what extent also what we do as public sector at the European level, at the national level, to support this need of the big businesses going more global, because the world in the meantime can become less open to the European businesses, because I can imagine that the emerging economies then can strengthen the integration among themselves, because it might be more convenient, taking into account the structures, their capacity to develop, their development needs, that they can be less open to the European companies. And that's why I think this is a challenge of today. This is the first thing. The second thing you mentioned at the beginning, this is contribution, because I think we should be more confident. I agree with you with regard to what we are contributing as the new member states or as the Central and Eastern European states into the European Union. Because every enlargement, I think, has been bringing something new, like the Nordic enlargement very clearly brought more transparency, which means democracy also, the quality of democracy could have improved. But what we have brought into, certainly this, that everything is possible, this feeling that a grand change is possible if you want to do it, but also the entrepreneurial spirit. And I think this gives us, I think, today the chance to be, I think, to influence also the way of thinking, because economically we are still a very small economy, but in terms of thinking, of ideas, as you were saying, I think that this should be our job. And there is a chance, because what is the major problem of Europe is the youth unemployment. And the young guys, they don't want to do what their grandparents and parents were doing, and that's exactly what we need, new sources of growth, new jobs being really created in new sectors, in new enterprises. And I think if we manage to get this more than 20% of the young people unemployed into a new thinking of job creation, to make them think that it's not about looking for a job, but it's about creating a job, then I think we will be saved and we'll get out of the crisis and put our economy on the path towards sustained or sustainable growth. And the last thing I would like to say is this image, because I think what Professor Norman Davies was saying about the knowledge in general, but also about the knowledge about Europe, about us globally in the world. Europe has its global brand, without doubts. I mean, talk to the Chinese. I mean, it's very clear that there is a global brand, and this terrible crisis is undermining this global brand. It's not only Anglo-Saxon media, which we should stop reading, I think, as Europeans, not to feel frustrated all the time, but in general in Europe, I think this global brand is under threat. And what can we do to avoid this that this goes on? I think business should be part of the response clearly, but also I think the finally agreeing on all the needed reforms that could bring the end to the current crisis, even though I think even the smartest reforms will not reduce the Greek debt, and we need a special solution for this.
Dziękuję bardzo. President Köhler, you certainly share the enthusiasm of Dr. Kulczyk for Africa. You know the continent extremely well. You care about the continent, as everybody knows. What can we do but do we have a responsibility for Africa? Is Africa an opportunity for Europe? What do we need to explore this continent? Just economic competition, or do we also have to work a little bit on the rules? But we have a competition with countries like China, and the end of the competition depends also on how we define the rules. Does it take, in other words, also a political initiative to be successful in exploring the African market and establishing a partnership with Africa, which I believe Africa needs, but maybe we need it too?
Well, thank you, Ambassador Reiter, that you addressed me as a kind of Africa expert. Well, I traveled a lot in Africa, and I learned a lot, to be honest, from Africans. I learned a lot about, for instance, human dignity. In our constitution in Germany, the first article is, die Menschenwürde ist unantastbar. But in Germany, people immediately complain when living conditions are tough. That is against the human dignity. When you look to and experience the hardships really in Africa, you can realize what really human dignity is. The women in particular in Africa care about their children in the direst, difficult circumstances. That is what I took from Africa, and from there also a kind of understanding. It is important that this continent is no longer seen what was 10 years ago the so-called lost continent, the continent of chaos, wars, and only poverty. Meanwhile, and that is in all studies, not least in the so-called Africa Progress Panel, chaired by Kofi Annan, they call themselves now the continent of opportunity, because growth since 10 years is strong in Africa. Above 5%. From World Bank forecasts are going the direction that Africa can grow with 7% or more on the average on a sustained basis. They can grow even more than China. Why is this? Of course, first because of the mathematical basis very, very low. But clearly now we know that the African population will grow from 1 billion people to 2 billion people in 2050. Relatively stable forecast. Second, I mean, everybody knows on this planet of limited resources. The fortunes which are below the earth in Africa, oil, gold, coltan, and so on, that is something now the industrial countries, but also, of course, China, India, are looking for. They want to have and extract these resources for their own, say, advantage. And here I feel, and that is my advice to the Africans, they should be decisive to make the best, say, out of these natural resources in Africa for their own people. Not just allowing the industrial world to extract oil and other natural resources, but the rest is, and this is transported to the industrialized world, but the people in Africa don't have an advantage from that. Therefore, and at least what I know from my many, many visits, there is a growing entrepreneurial layer in Africa. Entrepreneurs who care, who invest, who don't need to be lectured anymore by us how to run an investment. What is needed in Africa and for Africa is in particular two things. A trade regime or trade regimes which are fairer. The European agricultural policy, for instance, in my view, is not fair enough to Africans. And the issue that the Africans can't feed themselves, for instance, is a tragedy and a disaster for the whole world, because still 60% of all arable land is located in Africa. But they can't help themselves, and the outside world is just to help in the interest to help themselves, to bring all the advantages to them. So there is a really good chance for the Africans to get more living standards, better living standards, if and when they are able to process their own natural resources. And that is the second point. Better trade regimes and also investments which enable the Africans to process their natural resources. Of course, then we still can, get from them resources. And here will be the crucial test of all these rhetorics about morale and support and partnership. For the moment, I can't see, neither in Europe, neither in the US, that there is a political will to help the Africans to build up their own manufacturing sector, their own manufacturing industry. And this is dangerous because, as I said before, in 2050 there will be 2 billion Africans. And even today, already, 60% of the Africans of today are younger than 15 years and younger. You can imagine that in 2015 there are all these young people. If they are not getting jobs or access to jobs, we will see a disaster which may be much bigger than what we experience now in the north of Africa, where that was not only an Arab rebellion, it was an Arab young people's rebellion, and still we have not found the right answer to that. So better trade regimes, better openness to enable the Africans also to transform natural resources to processed products will help them much. And a basic point for this is to achieve is best possible education for the young people. I'm absolutely not pessimistic that the Africans can come out of this hole of poverty and disaster if and when we enable them to grow, and if and when we enable them to create jobs in their own region. That doesn't mean, and that is, if you want so, also part of the German experience. At the beginning of all this globalization, there was a fierce debate in Germany that, for instance, German companies who invested in China or in Poland would cut off jobs in Germany. The experience on balance that, say, investments out of Germany in Poland made more secure jobs in Germany. And that is the same with China, that will be the same in Africa.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Dziękuję bardzo, panie prezydencie. Proszę nie myśleć, że myśmy uciekli z Europy Środkowo-Wschodniej, czyli od naszego tematu, na inne kontynenty.
Trying to distance ourselves from the European problems because we are on a different continent. Professor Hübner said that Europe had become inward looking. We should not be repeating the mistake. And a question to Dr. Kulczyk now. If Europe has its commitment and duty, a sense of duty towards the world, then how should the Europe get organized itself? Today, it is divided. Perhaps what we need today is to use this huge potential for a new political initiative towards better integrity and unity in Europe. Would you advocate that?
Najważniejszą to nie patrzeć na to, jakie my mamy obowiązki wobec świata, tylko jakie mamy szanse.
Look at our duties and obligations towards the world. Let's look at our opportunities, or the opportunities out there in the world. Obviously, the world is also Southern Asia and Africa. The Mediterranean region, it's the Mediterranean. When we go to Africa, it's across our own Mediterranean region. Why are the Chinese so strong down there in Africa? Because they have created their provisional fund, their reserve to support African investment. In Poland, we did have a similar reserve to support our investment in Poland. Nothing came out of there. Now, in Greece, 340 billion, 350 billion. It's 1/4 of the whole African GDP, because it's 1.6 million. If we give ourselves a chance, we are not going to colonize it. We need to make it very clear. because this is the worst way. Let's unite our potential here in Europe, the potential of intellect, knowledge, technology, everything that we contribute and have contributed to the world. And on the other side, we have Africa with its 10% of the world oil and the potential in any other area. Unless we help ourselves by solving the African problem, we will have the African problem soon here. And Greece will become minor because the young people in Africa, because Africa is the youngest continent with the average age of 35, we're going to be flooded by them. And our problems will have to focus around the other issues. I believe that us, the Central and Eastern European countries, with our experience of transformation, we were going out of the socialist economy and we launched the market economy. We're able to take our nations, our experience, our know-how, and our opportunity, our potential. And I do agree 100% with you, Professor. This is the sine qua non condition, prerequisite. Unless we take this set of mind and get through to the way of thinking, we fail. We need to look, because this is our opportunity. This is where our opportunities are. Politicians sometimes are wrong, sometimes are, it may be wrong or right to have 4-year cycles electing new politicians. But this is not the way economy works. It's long term. We can't be handling ad hoc our problems ad hoc. Our economy has its cycles, also its cycles, but these are 30, 40 cycles. Just to recap, perhaps Professor Davies and President Köhler. Professor Davies, are you convinced that this crisis may become a strong driving force for the integration, the crisis in Europe? Yes, absolutely. For a few last years, I've been saying this, that we absolutely needed a crisis. Complacency was ruling. Everything was just going forward, and people forgot about what debt and what a budget means. The main problem in Europe is a political problem. No leadership, no vision. When we have the vision and leadership back, then the crisis will disappear. But we needed a crisis in order to push Europeans to thinking. President Köhler,
in Europe always was pushed by crises. But I'm a bit cautious to really say it very strongly, because this crisis is really serious, and we have not yet found the way out. And I agree with Professor Davies. There are a lot of technicalities, funds, and all of this. The decisive point is leadership, and indeed a vision. My vision is clear. The crisis is demonstrating that we need to move forward, deepening integration. That's easier said than done, at least also in my own country. But this should be the response, and I still believe this will be the response. And on this basis, I'm not pessimistic about Europe and its role in the world, but still a lot has to happen in order to bring us out of this mess.
I also have to say two things. One is that finally, I know that there are two people in the world that have envisaged this crisis, because Nouriel Roubini was always considered as the only one. Now Norman Davies was the other one who was, you even sound like if you were contributing to this crisis, like you were asking for this crisis to happen and you got it. But I think that it's not true that we are doing nothing, that Europe is not responding. I think Europe has never done with such a speed so many reforms in its history. If you think that Lehman Brothers collapsed around August, in September the Council, it was the French presidency, already decided on the financial supervision, and then in a year and a half it was up and running, and we are basically nearly weekly taking tremendously difficult decisions, and Europe is much more integrated today, Eurozone in terms of economic governance, financial sector across European Union. So we have to admit that we have not found, as President Köhler said, yet the miracle, the last drop that we need to get out of the crisis, and to be sure that we will have also the capacity to get out of any further crisis that will come. But we are really doing the reforms in spite of the fact that for many of them we need to agree among 27 member states. And on Africa, just please one more thing, because it's not like Europe does not know that Africa exists. I think we are the globally number one contributor in terms of development aid to Africa. We have a lot of policies and a lot of things have been done over the last decades for Africa. We are not doing it probably in the way it should be done. But then for business, who prevents the big business from Europe going to Africa and doing the infrastructure investment, which I think is one more element that Africa needs. I think if the business needs support coming from European institutions, like, for example, finally a common European strategy for Africa, then you should push the European institutions, including Council, to generate such a strategy. But just going to Africa, I think nobody is saying to European business, don't do it.
We are urged to finish. One sentence.
Jedną tylko rzecz, którą chciałbym powiedzieć, bo myślę, że to uciekło.
Because somehow we missed that. No, we are not escaping from Europe to Africa and declare it to be solution for everything. Let's think about Africa applying economical categories. When you think about the energy, the huge debate on energy, in Germany we want to close down nuclear power plants. In Poland we are about to build such nuclear power plants. In Ukraine, they have 40% surplus of energy because of nuclear power plants. Now, unless we start thinking about Europe as one economy and our political interests, and then we stop thinking about political interests. I mentioned Africa because this is going forward. This is new markets. And new markets are where consumers are. And the consumers are the 6 billion people. So politicians should understand that the economic equation is the fundamental thing. Without it, we can't do anything. First above all, economic equation. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to bring this debate to end. We started with this title, Expect the Unexpected. It might be very interesting to test different nations and try to find out what they understand by expect the unexpected. Some of them would be concerned and worried with dangers and threats. In our corner of Europe, we've over the last 20 years, we've had more positive experiences in terms of expect the unexpected. let's try to stick to the discourse of hope rather than discourse of fear in Europe. And this is the spirit of our discussion. Thank you very much, panelists. Thank you very much, the audience, for your listening.